In the 1900s, a small secluded village like Nagyrév couldn't experience the leisure of having proper medical care. There was no resident doctor to attend to the sick, and those in need were left with no options. But it seemed that their suffering transformed in 1911 when the midwife Zsuzsanna Fazekas came into the village armed with a pack of references for her basic medical skills and midwifery experience. Zsuzsanna had no difficulty settling in and quickly established herself within the community. People spoke highly of her, and she had everyone's appreciation, regardless of the doomed or perhaps shady background she bared. Her storyline had her first husband dying mysteriously shortly after an illness, but she did not wait for long as a grieving widow. Zsuzsanna wedded for a second time to a man who had his own land and a house to live in. It was all blissful in her life until husband number 2 also inexplicably died less than 2 years later from yet another mysterious illness, leaving behind all of his fortune and his wife as the sole beneficiary. The twice-widowed woman was the envy among the married ones in the village. Zsuzsanna's ill fortune seemed a desirable life event rather than bad luck to them. These feelings were owed to the fact that the local society back in the 1900s had young girls forced into marriage from their teenage years, where they had no choice but to obey their family's orders, into enduring a loveless marriage, and many times with much older men. Divorce was not a legal option for them, and on many occasions they had to suffer under their husband's bad attitude, cheating habits, drunken tendencies, and violent outbursts. They had to breathe in fear every day for the rest of their lives. Thus they craved the same freedom Zsuzsanna had, no husband to obey and her own property to enjoy. But what they did have was Zsuzsanna by their side. Besides cures and treatments, many midwives were also viewed as knowledgeable figures where women would turn to during the dark times of their lives, and Zsuzsanna was no exception. She took the role of the so-called wise woman in Nagyrév, and the local women often visited her to consult her for their personal troubles. By 1914, the First World War drafted most men to serve, leaving behind their wives and children. The now half-empty Nagyrév was converted into a holding camp for the Allied prisoners of war. With no local men around, the prisoners were forced to work in the local farms. As the time passed, the men eased more and more into the village life and began forming several relationships with the married women. By the time the war ended, the women became emotionally independent, and for the first time they experienced a feeling of autonomy, and inevitably also acquired the unwillingness to return to a life of subservience. Then came 1918. With the end of the war, the men returned back to the village and to their wives, and surely back to their old forceful habits. Having their husbands back home was not a heartwarming event for most women, especially after they experienced a sense of liberation and numerous affairs in their husband's absence. The fact that most men returned injured and too damaged from the war that rendered them unable to work on the farms added significantly to their wives' frustration. They couldn't bear the thought of having to learn to live with them once more, and divorce was still not an option available to them. Now feeling unhappy, suppressed, and overburdened with having to not only tolerate but also care for their spouses without the comfort of their lovers, they sought once again the advice of the wise woman. "If there's a problem with him," she replied to them, "I have a simple solution." The post-war outcomes not only triggered intolerable resentment against their husbands, but also awoke a sense of greediness for the women to have the land all to themselves. The situation was best conveyed by a defense lawyer in the trials when he said, "Nagyrév was eaten then the war came, the peace came, poverty followed. Instead of plenty there was barrenness, instead of joy, despair. No priest ever visited them, no doctor came to cure their sick. In Nagyrév, where most people could not read or write, desperation was breeding greed." Poverty and hunger were the norm conditions. Proper medical management was sparse, since the few overworked and underpaid doctors very rarely visited the village to care for those in need. This lack of medical supervision, combined with the local women's motives, gave way to the opportunistic intentions Zsuzsanna had to embark the dark angel business. Zsuzsanna recognized that she had a powerful weapon in her hands, one that she could devise and sell, and one that could pass undetected, especially in a community like Nagyrév. The idea came to her when she realized that chickens were dying after consuming dead flies called in fly papers, so she decided to perform an experiment. She boiled the paper and by some means formulated a poisonous solution with the residual fluid. She then administered the liquid in an animal and then proceeded to test it on a male patient whose family found bothersome. Both slipped away in agony. Married women who sought guidance from Zsuzsanna were persuaded that the only way to silence their troubles forever would be to take matters into their own hands and kill their husbands. In exchange for a fee, Zsuzsanna sold the poison with the guarantee that this was untraceable in the body. Zsuzsanna had also enlisted the help of a local woman to act as a clerk, writing up and supplying death certificates that obscured the real cause of death in the murder by proxy plot. The grand scheme had a strict rule. Only unhappy married women could take part. If they were single or happily married, they were excluded from the crime syndicate. Word spread very fast among the married women, and their husbands were dying at a parallel speed. They could be disabled, blind, or simply too controlling. Whatever the ailment, their fate was the same. Their wives would poison their food or drink and watch them suffer to their final breath. But soon the husbands were not the only target. On many occasions, when their mothers or fathers, siblings, or even their own babies were deemed a burden they wished to spare, Zsuzsanna would exclaim, "Why put up with them?" and then handed them a bottle of her finest potion, instructions on how to use it, and pocketed her fee. Over the years, the men in the village became frightened. They were watching friends, relatives, children, and parents dying before their eyes, suffering through unbearable symptoms until their end, and they were probably wondering, could they be next? The killing spree secret was kept stored among them until 1929, and it served them well for all those years. For them it was the perfect plan and solution to their problem. They were free to marry someone of their choice, or keep the land to themselves, or both. And for Zsuzsanna, it was an easy way of earning money and gain more power as their leader. The figure of how many died over the years varies widely, and no historian has been able to provide a definitive number to the death toll. In the village of Nagyrév, it was believed to have a total of approximately 100 deaths. By 1919, the birth rate was estimated to be almost as equal to the death rate instead of surpassing it, but the death epidemic fell into its end 10 years later in 1929. Exactly how the Angel-Makers were uncovered is uncertain, with different versions attached to the story. One had two of the poisoners having a fallout between them, and each naming the other in public as a killer. Another claimed an anonymous letter was sent to the authorities providing a full account of the whole situation and naming Zsuzsanna as the mastermind. Yet another version had a body discovered by a medical student in a neighboring town where the poisonous substance was detected and the investigation followed. And the final version told the story of a woman getting caught while administering the poison into a man's wine. Whatever the way, a criminal rumor reached authorities, and they acted upon it when they realized men of good health were mysteriously dying in Nagyrév. The village itself earned the nickname the Murder District. Upon their investigation, they arrested Zsuzsanna and searched her cottage house, where they found several bottles with the special paper soaking in water. But they needed more than that. They needed to connect the deaths with the widows, so they let Zsuzsanna free and started following her instead. They knew that their ringleader would eventually reveal others involved. How they connected the women to the deaths is also unclear. The definitive fact is that 45 to 50 bodies were exhumed from the local cemetery, where some claim that they detected the poison on them, whereas others suggest that the poisonous spree was actually confirmed by a nail test done to a baby's body after it died, where they spotted dark splotches under the nails and conclusively proved the presence of that poison. Although the estimation was over 100 murders, some of the bodies were never located, and rumor had it that some of the women managed to switch the tombstones to confuse the authorities. Nonetheless, Zsuzsanna's guarantee of non-detection crumbled, and after several arrests, 26 women stood trial and sentenced for the murders based on the evidence they found. It was remarked that all women seemed rather bored at the trial, with no hint of remorse, but rather they justified their actions. 8 received a death sentence, but only 2 of them were executed, and 12 others received life imprisonment. Zsuzsanna escaped her final arrest and trial just before police came to arrest her. It is a story that now belongs in the distant past, a tale that no longer imparts fear. But there are still suspicions that men of Nagyrév were not the only victims. It was claimed that nearby villages were inspired by Zsuzsanna's monstrous actions, and eventually saw too a disturbingly high number of deaths among the locals. And that could account to approximately 300 deaths in total. Some reports have Zsuzsanna embarking her murder by proxy career as early as 1911, when she first moved into the village, and with time eased the other women to become her followers and to persuade them with her power as the wise woman to kill their family members. But for that we will never know. What is certain is that after the scandalous murders were revealed, the men apparently started behaving with much kindness towards their women. Until next time,